For years, a lone cowboy lived by himself, till a stunning Apache girl bleeds came to knock on his door. Shepherd Thorne had spent 12 years ensuring that no one would locate his cabin nestled in the canyon walls. However, when he unlocked that wooden door at first light, covered in blood, as she broke down every barrier he'd erected around his heart. The mist of morning continued to cling to the jagged summits when the faint tapping at Thorne's ears his door. Mid-step, he froze, coffee cup hanging on his grizzled palm. Nobody was aware of this location. Damn, he had made certain about that. The noise resurfaced, this time softer, as if someone barely had the power to raise their knuckles. His thoughts. World with potentialities. Bounty hunters were no longer pursuing him, years in the past. This was never attempted by settlers, deep within the Apache homeland. The closest it took 3 days to get to town. Mountain passes that are dangerous. Yet the tapping continued, faint and frantic. Thorne put his cup down and grabbed for the firearm dangling over the hearth. His fingers shook a little, but not because terror, but from the unfamiliar sensation of human interaction following a long period of choose to live alone. He had constructed this stronghold of seclusion on purpose, mile by mile, stone by stone, from civilization. Through the tiny window, he saw a flash of black hair and ripped cloth. There was a heavy leaning person, just standing near his doorframe. Waiting for them would be wise. Out, let the person who did it go or collapse in another location. That's what the just as old Thorne would have. The individual who had discovered that assisting others only resulted in pain and treachery. However, something regarding the way the knocks were feeble with every try, they became dimmer, sparked a deep-seated thing in him, against all of his instincts that had protected him alive and isolated. Unlatching the Thorne massive wooden door, she fell forward, before he could take a step back into his arms. The long black hair of a young Apache woman, dried blood stuck in her hair, her a-ripped, crimson-stained buckskin dress. She was shallowly breathing, and her olive blood loss that makes the skin pale, but even broken and unconscious. Her face had a ferocious quality that caused Thorne's chest to constrict with a he had forgotten the existence of emotion. He ought to have left her outside, have shut the door and acted as though this never took place. Raids by Apaches had been growing recently, and possessing one of their injuries can result in death if the wrong people learned. However, as he gazing down at her frail body in his embrace, sensing the flutter of her heartbeat against Thorne's chest, revealed that 12 years of fleeing his past had recently been caught together with him. The wise decision would be to promptly heal her and send her on in her direction. However, as he led her to observing how her fingers gripped his bed, losing strength at his shirt, even in Thorne felt unconsciousness, this everything would alter. With a lady, and he wasn't certain what he was prepared for. That implied. Thorne softly placed her on his scratchy blankets made of wool, then stepped back as though she were about to blow up. His palms trembled as he gazed at the gushing blood. Through her gown he had made amends. Injured creatures in the past, even healing his own gunshot wounds during times of need. However, this was not like the others. This was a woman, not simply any woman, but Apache. The tales he had been told in saloons returned in droves. Stories of Apache fighters with the ability to follow a man several weeks, who engaged in fierce combat that caused resolute troops to cry, and they claimed that their ladies were equally hazardous and able to cut a neck while muttering kind phrases. Each and every sensible reasoning begged him to block the door and put her back outside. However, he observed the rise and fall of her chest in breathing difficulties. Those tales appeared like poison from a different life. This wasn't a menace or a warrior. This was the daughter of someone is bleeding on his bed. Someone who had suffered severe harm sufficient to stutter across kilometers of difficult landscape only to arrive at his door. Thorne made himself get up. He warmed over the fire with water and collected what he had: medical supplies, primarily alcohol, for sanitizing cuts and fabric strips ripped from tattered clothes. His motions were mechanical, but his thoughts were racing with inquiries. From where had she come? Who had harmed her, and why did she show up? Make his meticulously planned world seem as if it were breaking apart? As she brought the hot water closer, her eyes opened up, dark brown, nearly dark. They stared at him with alarm, intensity. Most individuals would have demonstrated fear of awakening in an unfamiliar location, hurt and exposed. However, her eyes contained an additional object, a vicious intelligence that appeared to be straight. Through him, she attempted to sit up and instantly flinched and retreated against the cushion. She gave a quiet gasp. Lips, but no scream came from her. Even she wouldn't show that she was weak and injured. Sort of openness to an outsider. Thorn was aware of that obstinate pride. For years he had worn it like armor. "Easy," he replied in a scratchy voice from abandonment. Her eyes said, "You're hurt bad," narrowed, looking at his face as though learning every aspect by heart. As she said, although she spoke English clearly, her accent was the sounds of her native music language. "You're not who I anticipated to locate." The straightforward phrase struck him more difficult than it ought to have been. Why had she anticipated? A weathered mountain guy? Do you live like an animal? An insane recluse who would ask questions and shoot first, later? He understood that, after 12 years of alone, he had never truly witnessed himself as seen by another person. He acknowledged, "Neither are you," then instantly wished he hadn't spoken close. A specter of a smile appeared over her mouth before it was removed by pain. "My name is Ayana, and you are the ghost." The elders mentioned this man. The one who vanished into the mountains and never came back. Thorn's blood froze. If the Apache was aware of him and knew his whereabouts, lived, after which his haven was compromised. All of the things he had constructed to it was pointless. To keep the world away, but before he could go into full panic, he was stunned by Ayana's subsequent statement. "You lost someone, they say. That sorrow created a shadow out of you?" Her dark eyes did not pass judgment, but rather his chest hurt to grasp that. I understand that suffering. The susceptibility in something inside of him shattered at her voice. That he had believed to be forever broken. He had persuaded for 12 years, convinced himself that solitude meant power, felt he was indestructible because he didn't need anyone. However, this injured stranger saw right through, as if his fortifications were composed of paper. As he extended his hand to touch her bleeding dress to evaluate her injuries, Ayana discovered with unexpected vigor at his wrist. Electricity ran up his arm at the touch, a reminder of his humanity underneath various levels of exile that one has imposed on oneself. "Before you decide whether to help me," her voice grew weaker as she whispered, "you must to understand that assisting me will take them here, and they won't inquire. Inquiries first." The burden of her thorn was surrounded by warning like a death shroud. He had worked for 12 years to construct the ideal hiding spot, and now this lady was assuring him everything would be useless. Therefore, assisting her meant decorating his back with a target that would never go away. All of his survival instincts sharp yelled for him to pull her. Go outside and let things happen as they will. However, as he met her gaze, deteriorating with every ragged breath, something fundamental changed within him. Perhaps it was the tone of her voice. Of loss, acknowledging the emptiness that had pushed him to this mountain exile. Perhaps it was only that 12 years of talking exclusively to his horse. The human understanding sound was too valuable to give up. "Who's arriving?" he inquired, softly urging her to removing his wrist's fingers so he could look at her injuries. "White men. They assaulted our camp at first light, killing the children first," she said steadily. However, Thorn noticed the shudder beneath the surface. "I was collecting plants by the river when the yelling reached my ears. Too many people tried to assist." He cautiously raised the ripped cloth. From her gown, Thorn could see a profound slit where a knife had cut. Her ribs discovered its mark. The injury was severe. However, with the right care, not lethal. What the way she said worried him more. Regarding the assault, not out of animosity as one could anticipate, but with a bone-deep fatigue that indicated too much violence observed. "These men," he said, sighed, gently cleansing the wound as feasible. They are pursuing you, especially. Ayana gave a sour laugh. Chief Nalish was my father. The white troops have been attempting to apprehend his family for months in order to take advantage of us. When they were unable to locate our main camp, they choose to provide an illustration of the smaller clusters. Thorn was hit by the name. Like a hit to the body? He was familiar with Nalnish, a commander renowned for his tactical genius and his resistance to being led like livestock onto reservations. If this he was helping a woman who was his daughter wasn't only risky, it was a declaration of war directed at the territory administration. Jesus, he said, breathed, then regretted right away the oath at witnessing her recoil. You're afraid them, she noted, examining his features. For that reason, you hide here like an injured animal. The charge hurt since it included truth. Thorn had been he spent so much time escaping his own troubles. That bravery seemed alien idea, however. Something about the way she stated it without derision or disdain, simply sorrowful acknowledgement which inspired him to disprove her. I'm afraid of who I'll become. He acknowledged, when I stop. Running, though he was surprised by the words that came out. Ayana's eyes got a little bigger. In that, to be honest, something happened, in between them. An awareness that both had scars that were too deep for casual ease. However, before either could investigate that link even more, the sound of hoofbeats reverberated from the canyon walls. She quickly reached out and grasped his arm with frantic vigor. They discovered my path. Moving toward the window, Thorn leaning against the wall while he looked through the window. 3 cyclists cautiously made their way along their eyes scouring the narrow canyon path, the stony landscape like pursuing wolves. Even from afar he could make out the military demeanor in their stance. Methodically, they looked at each shadow and crack. Cavalry, he said, whispered. Bounty hunters are worst. They are paid to work for the territory. Extra for making. Apache come to life? Ayana found it difficult to sit up in spite of her wounds. I must be hidden if they will also kill you if you find me here. It was clear that she was playing smart. Give her over, assert that he had discovered her unconscious. Gather whatever prize they provided. Would take care of his current issue and likely gain him enough favor to conceal his whereabouts. 12 years of careful survival was not something that could be ignored. For an outsider, regardless of those gloomy eyes, appeared to look directly into his soul. However, Thorn observed the authors come closer, something familiar and chilling. His chest ached and he realized their kind. Men who had made money and other people's pain, who provided justification. Cruelty with court documents and men prefer. Territorial orders who, 12 years ago, had ruined his life? A root merchant is responsible for the fireplace, he uttered softly. A concealed panel if you don't talk, you can fit. Ayana's expression changed from one of resignation to surprise. You jeopardize your security for a new acquaintance. Thorn didn't respond right away. The hoof. Betats were approaching, and he could hear them voices now. The gruff, assured tones of guys used to stealing what they want. Rather than answering her query, he assisted her in standing up, bearing her weight while they were in motion toward the direction of the fireplace. Can you stay? Quiet, even if they spend hours looking. Her words, I have hidden from worse, but she was clearly grateful. As Thorn unlocked the hidden panel and assisted her in navigating the little area, their faces pressed together. For a brief instant, the immediate threat subsided when he discovered himself researching the chosen collection of the way fear and pain couldn't stop her jaw put out the fire in her eyes. Please. Despite her beauty, she had a fierce beauty that conveyed a message of survival and strength as opposed to fragility. She said, Why help? Why refinement? Me? That question hovered between them, full with ramifications. Neither was prepared to investigate. Thorn considered a dozen useful responses. Fundamental human morality, distaste for bounty hunters, straightforward loneliness. But the reality was more intricate, connected to the manner in which her something had been aroused by his presence, believed to be permanently buried. Perhaps. He muttered. I'm tired of running. Ayana was about to reply when she heard the sound of his porch's boots signaled their guests. Thorn promptly closed the panel and went to the door to answer it. My mind is buzzing with potential tailies. However, when he grabbed the clasp, he had an awful realization. A bucket of water and bleeding bandages were seated invisible on his table. The bed remains motionless, wore the scars from her injuries. Even worse, he saw new drops of blood heading to the fireplace from the door, a path that any skilled tracker would proceed directly to where she is hiding. The beating on his door intensified, persistent, with a voice that open up and don't back down territory. The hand of Thorn stuck on the latch. In an attempt to save, he'd made a critical error. Ayana, their lives were now in jeopardy. Of any narrative he could make up the following half hour. If you were Thor, try to bluff your way to success via the clear proof, or make a confession and pray for forgiveness. Let me know in the remarks. Please let me know which side you would decide, because of what Thorn determined next would ascertain if Thorn and Thorn both live for sunsets. Wrenched the door open with deliberate anger, as though the disruption had truly irritated him instead of frightened him. 3 men were standing on his porch, their hands lazily resting on their weapons belts. The man in charge was a ruthless man wearing a badge that appeared more purchased than earned. "Morning," muttered Thorn, obstructing his body. In the doorway, "You guys lost?" Briggs, Deputy Marshal Clayton, the leader, declared, but he did nothing to display the appropriate credentials. "Where blood is pursuing a violent Apache woman." "Thorn, the trail leads directly to your door. Track the red drips with their eyes." He was working on his wooden porch, madly. The proof was incriminating. But if he played, it wouldn't be fatal. This right. "You claim it's dangerous." Only an arrow and a half-dead deer were discovered, a deer in its side. The second man, staring more broadly and meanly, stepped closer. "That's quite practical. Narrative," Thorn added. "Check for yourself," pointing to a stack of bloody towels been butchering close to his cutting block. Throughout the morning, meats were hanging in the smokehouse for evidence. It was a frantic wager, but Thorn had been processing a deer, murdered 2 days prior. The timing could not have been luckier, allowing his falsehood to be believed, but Deputy Briggs wasn't really convinced. "Would you mind if we looked inside?" Just to be thorough, making sure that every Thorn is wished to avoid slamming the door and grasp his firearm, but doing so would only validate their suspicions. Rather, he moved aside, seemingly reluctantly. "I need to get to work, so hurry up." When 3 men walked into his cabin, their gazes recording every detail right away. As Briggs, Thorn's heart pounded toward the direction of the table where the bloody there were still bandages in a reddish-colored basin. It was water. The point at which the narrative would either hold or fall apart. Utterly untidy business slaughter. Briggs watched, grabbing one of the strips of cloth. "A deer kicked as I was dressing it, grabbed me by the hoof and tore. I got my shirt up quite nicely." Thorn rolled up his sleeve, exposing an ancient wound that can appear to be a new wound from a distance. "I had to bandage myself first. I covered the stake with blood." The third man, who had remained quiet up to this point, knelt. He ran his finger next to the hearth, across the stone fireplace. As he stood, Thorn's finger came away bloodied. The man's eyes made his stomach drop, constricted, going down the path that led straight to the panel that is hidden. "Interesting," murmured the man gradually. "This blood pattern indicates anything was pulled across the ground, something heavy." Briggs approached to look the proof, his hand currently resting on his pistol grip. "Friend, you know that I've been monitoring injured animals for 20 years, and it doesn't appear to be a deer blood to me." Silence descended over the cabin. Aside from the sound of the fire crackling, Thorn sensed the presence of Ayana behind the wall. I could practically feel her holding her breath while death whirled around her closer. Now, one incorrect word would spell disaster, each of them. A funny aspect of Apache. "Blood," Briggs added, talkatively. "It's worth $50 since the temperature remains warm. If you're having fun with the story, please follow the channel." Danger lingered in the atmosphere like smoke from a Thorn sensed the walls of his funeral home, a meticulously crafted world is closing in. 12 years of seclusion are coming to an end in gunshots and blood, but something had altered him since he opened that door. To discover Ayana on his porch bleeding. Man who had been jogging for more than 10 years from conflict was gone, and in its stead was someone who could recall how it felt to defend a cause that was important. Thorne softly reiterated, $50. That's what you value a human life. Briggs. A smile that was devoid of warmth. There are animals, and Apaches are not human. That must be put down, he pointed to his men. Examine this area thoroughly. Location, she's here someplace. The larger a guy approached the hearth as the third started knocking over stuff. Thorne observed them ruining his sanctuary. These badge-bearing men, but behaved as though they were wolves in a henhouse. His hand crept over to the dangling weapon. Over the mantel, but Briggs managed to capture the motion right away. I wouldn't. As a warning, Deputy Marshal used his own weapon. 3 against 1 isn't half drawn, odds for sports. It depends on the 3. Thorne spoke softly. Something in his all 3 men paused at the tone. There was a silence now surrounding Thorne, a predatory serenity that conveyed violence held under close scrutiny. The man who was looking gradually straightened up by the fireplace, abruptly realizing that the recluse they'd captured for a defenseless victim may be anything much riskier. You understand what I believe? Briggs murmured, attempting to recover command of the circumstance. I believe you're the kind with a soft location for stories on Soba. Some bleeding in Apache princes arrives with stories of you forget which side you're on. Whoa, which side is that intended to be on? Thorne inquired, the murderous side kids in the morning. The words struck their Briggs's face darkened with the target. Rage, it was inevitable for those barbarians. They have been robbing communities, murdering decent Christians. We're introducing civilization to this region by pursuing injured women via the mountains that resemble animals. Briggs pulled out his weapon as needed. Now, and by getting rid of any idiot sufficient to house fugitives, the impasse 3 armed, stretched taut as abhorring males opposed to one another. But something regarding the odds seemed less likely due to Thorne's silence. Undoubtedly, the large man close to the fireplace had discovered the trail of blood, and was taking a closer look at the stones, his fingers searching for something concealed gaps. Next, from behind the hidden panel, the smallest sound emerged. A scarcely audible, discernible breath intake as Ayana tried to keep quiet in spite of her anguish. It was so silent that only it would be noticeable to those listening, but in the cabin's terrible silence it may have passed for a scream. The man's head froze at the fireplace, slanted as if a hunting dog had captured an aroma. Behind this, he murmured, something is breathing on the wall. The smile came back, victorious and vicious. It appears that our hermit has been maintaining secrecy, and having his rifle trained, he nodded to his soldiers and remarked on Thorne. Crack it open. Thorne's thoughts rushed through options, each of which ends in death and violence. He could attempt to taking them by surprise, but the odds are 3 to 1. Implied that at least one would live to cause harm. He may attempt to haggle, but guys such as these didn't honor agreements with those they viewed as inferior to them. As the men started looking at the fireplace, searching for the mechanism in further detail, Thorne opened the concealed panel by making his decision. He had run for 12 years from the effects of violence, concealing what he could do when pushed too far. However, some of the valuable enough to fight for, even if it meant letting loose the demons he had so diligently difficult to bury. You're curious about what's behind that wall? Thorne uttered, his voice with a fresh edge that made everything 3 men give him a weary look. You're ready to discover the true reason I came to these mountains. The change in Thorne appeared instantly and was frightful. The calm recluse who had come to his door was gone, and something predatory took its place. And deadly, his eyes grew as icy as frost. When he moved, it was with stone, the smooth accuracy of a man who'd slain previously, and would kill once more. Thorne remarked, the boys made one mistake, leaving the wall behind. You thought I was hibernating up here because I was terrified to engage in combat. Briggs maintained his Thorn's gun trained, but doubt his face twitched. What is that intended to imply? It indicates that I arrived at these mountains to escape from the things that I becoming when I'm pushed too far by others. Thorn spoke in a soothing conversational tone, which increased its ominousness exponentially. I served as a cavalry officer 12 years ago. To men like you, I lost my entire battalion. Thieves with badges who sold army positions and murdered excellent soldiers for financial gain. The large man close to the fireplace had discovered the secret machinery with his fingers at the hidden latch, but he stopped and looked apprehensively at Thorn. Something regarding the hermit's attitude had changed throughout dynamic in the space. I located Thorn, went on, every man accountable, advancing one more step toward the middle of it. Took me 2 years to find the room. I quickly killed some of them, but others, let's just assume that they had time to regret the decisions they made. You're lying, Briggs spoke, but there was a lack of conviction. Shepard, Captain Thorn, 5th Cavalry. Examine your terrain documents upon your return to the city. If the name floated in the air, you live that long. Even out here, the air is like a death sentence. In the woods, the myth of the corrupt cop who went on a rogue hunt, authorities were aware. The third man, who had been gently toppling furniture erect. Jesus Christ, he said. You are the ghost captain, it was whispered. You were declared dead. Dead would have been easier, said Thorn. However, anger kept me alive so I could complete what I got begun. I then came to bury that here. Man, the issue is that you... Guys just dug him up, back up. The hand of Briggs's rifle was trembling. Right now, he did not, however, drop the weapon. There are more people than you. Whatever you were, now you are merely an elderly recluse. Am I? When Thorn grinned, it was the most any one of them had a terrifying expression, never observed. I'll give you what I tell you. Give boys a chance. Now leave and forget you ever discovered this location. Hold on to pushing, and you'll find out why. I was referred to as the ghost captain. By last, the man by the hearth was able to activate the secret mechanism. The panel opened with a gentle click, exposing the small room in which Ayanna nestled. Her black eyes and her clothes were stained with blood, broad with suffering and disobedience. There she is, Briggs exhaled, his avarice conquering his mounting fear. $50 of Apache princes? However, as he took in the direction of the concealed compartment, Thorn shifted. The following events happened too quickly to be properly processed by the human eye. A violent blur that had been refined in 12 border conflicts and refined in 2 years of deliberate retaliation. The God help, the ghost captain had returned. Anyone was in his path. The thorns, his fingers flew to his belt's knife as he sprang forward, covering ground. 2 quick steps to Briggs. The deputy's marshal attempted to deliver his carrying a pistol, but Thorn was already within his defense. The blade discovering its make a precise surgical mark. Briggs fell without a shot being fired, as his life ebbed. His eyes wide with amazement, away. The lanky man beside the hearth searched for his weapon, but Thorn was unable to, already in motion. One strike to the, he gasped as his throat brought him to his knees for air that never would arrive. The third successfully removed his pistol's leather, advancing on Thorn's chest. However, the phantom captain swerved out of the shot and drew closer before the bounty hunter might fire once more, unless it was over in less than 30 seconds. 3 males died on the floor of Thorn's cabin, their blood seeping into the slats of wood in addition to the stains left by Ayanna's injuries. The ensuing quiet was thunderous, barely broken by Thorn's regulated respiration and the crackle of the flames. Ayanna appeared gently out of her hiding spot, giving preference to her wounded side, but moving silently on her. She observed the bloodshed without recoiling. Her black eyes are taking in the violence's effectiveness. When she did speak, her tone was devoid of just comprehension, not judgment. Well, the stories were real, she uttered quietly, the spectral commander who disappeared into myth. Amid the corpses, Thorn stood with his hands blood-stained, appearing more like he was more of a recluse than a murderer. He had turned into, I made an attempt to bury the man. In this place. I considered staying away from individuals long enough for me to forget what I could. You can't run, though. From your true being, Ayana noted, cautiously approaching his side. As I can't avoid being my father's, they stood together, daughter, in the aftermath. Two individuals who had discovered something surprising in one another's business. The violence had been essential, but it had also broken the thorns. Meticulously built fortifications had centered on his heart. For the initial 12 years later, he wasn't by himself with, "They'll send more," Ayana said, clarifying his demons, cautioned, "If these three don't come back, others are going to look." Thorn nodded, already anticipating. "Then we are unable to stay here. I'm familiar with locations farther out. The Apache used the mountains and caverns for generations. We may vanish." The word hung between us entirely. Thorn approached them, laden with potential. Her eyes, recognizing his own isolation, mirrored by those black eyes. "Until you prefer that I return you to your people." Ayana remained silent for a while. "Now, taking into account my father's war is not ending anytime soon, and following today the soldiers will continue to pursue me fiercely, but you already have gave up your shelter from me, and why would you answer the forced question further?" Thorn to face emotions he had suppressed for more than 10 years since arriving to these mountains. "I avoid feeling eerie because something has passed between them, then a comprehension that transcended words. They were both misfits who have been hurt by a society that had stolen everything they had treasured. However, they might discover something together, worth defending once more." As they assembled materials and ready to leave the Thorn's lone house of 12 years, Ayana lightly touched his arm. "The elders assert that we must occasionally lose everything in search of what we actually require." Thorn took one more glance around his cabin, and then returning to the woman who had just by knocking on the door, everything changed. His door, perhaps they're correct, vanished into the vastness of the mountains when the sun was at its highest. Two souls, they had taken solace in one another while they have nothing in the world. Them, leaving nothing but voids and the assurance that certain ties formed in courage and blood were unbreakable. The spectral captain had discovered his atonement, and Ayana had discovered a ready to accompany her in exile. Together, a new legend would be penned in the harsh environment of the American West. If you're finding the story entertaining, click here to subscribe to the channel. The screen's footage to hear a narrative with a truth even better than this. One so potent that it will alter your perspective. Devotion for all time.